The boardroom fell silent when Richard Blackwood announced that his nephew James would be taking over my position as Chief Technology Officer. 9 years of building their entire digital infrastructure, and I was being replaced by a 28-year-old marketing graduate who had never written a line of code in his life. The worst part wasn't the demotion, it was the way Richard looked at me when he said it, as if my sexuality had finally become too much of an inconvenience for his traditional family business. But when their £300 million system crashed exactly 9 seconds after I walked out. Richard Blackwood learned that replacing someone because they're gay doesn't make your nephew any less incompetent. Growing up gay in Manchester taught me early that survival meant being twice as good as everyone else. In university, while my straight classmates were networking at rugby matches and pub crawls, I was alone in computer labs, teaching myself programming languages that wouldn't be taught for another 2 years. I told myself that excellence would be my armor against prejudice. By 35, I had climbed my way to CTO of Blackwood Financial Technologies, one of London's most prestigious fintech companies. I had designed every algorithm, secured every protocol, and personally overseen the development of their revolutionary trading platform. My sexuality was known, but never discussed a careful balance I maintained by working longer hours, delivering impossible results, and never giving anyone a reason to question my professionalism. But in corporate Britain, being exceptional while gay often means you're tolerated rather than celebrated. You learn to read the micro expressions when you mention your partner, the subtle exclusions from golf weekends and family dinners, the way conversations stop when you enter a room. You develop an almost supernatural ability to sense when your queerness is being weighed against your usefulness. I had spent nearly a decade proving that I belonged in their world, never realizing that some people will always see your identity as a flaw that needs to be overlooked rather than a strength that deserves recognition. They thought they were discarding me like outdated software. But every line of code I had written was about to remind them that some things can't be replaced, especially not by nepotism and homophobia. If you've ever felt like you had to hide who you are to succeed, the story is for you. Subscribe to this channel because today we're talking about what happens when prejudice meets incompetence and why being authentic is the only sustainable strategy in business. My typical morning at Blackwood Financial began at 6:30 a.m. with a double espresso and a review of overnight system performance. The London office occupied 3 floors of a Victorian building in Canary Wharf, its glass facade reflecting the Thames as the city awakened. I loved those quiet early hours when the servers hummed peacefully and my code ran exactly as intended. The development team respected me, not just for my technical expertise, but for the way I had transformed Blackwood from a traditional investment firm into a cutting-edge fintech powerhouse. Sarah, our lead developer, often said I was the only CTO she knew who could debug legacy COBOL and design machine learning algorithms with equal expertise. David from cybersecurity credited me with building the most secure trading platform in Europe. Emma from data analytics appreciated how I translated complex technical concepts for the board without dumbing them down. But respect from my team couldn't shield me from the subtle hostilities that permeated the upper management levels. Richard Blackwood, the CEO and company founder, came from old money and older ideas about what a technology leader should look like. He never said anything explicitly homophobic, but his discomfort was palpable whenever I mentioned my partner Marcus or declined invitations to heteronormative social events. The microaggressions were constant and calculated. During board meetings, Richard would interrupt me mid-sentence to ask if I was certain about technical decisions I had spent months researching. He would refer to other CTOs as brilliant while describing me as competent or adequate. When clients visited, he would introduce me with subtle disclaimers about my unique perspective or different approach, code words that everyone understood. The worst part was watching him promote less qualified straight men over me for cross-departmental leadership roles. When the company expanded into European markets, He appointed his golf partner Jeremy as head of international operations, despite Jeremy having no relevant experience. When we launched our mobile platform, he brought in his former university roommate to oversee marketing, completely bypassing my recommendations for internal candidates. I began to notice that my technical victories were attributed to the team, while my rare mistakes were personally mine. When our trading algorithm generated record profits, Richard told investors it was a collaborative effort. When a minor security patch caused a 2-minute delay in processing, he made sure everyone knew it was Oliver's oversight. The isolation was perhaps more damaging than the professional slights. While my straight colleagues were invited to Richard's country house for weekend retreats, I received formal email invitations to attend if my schedule permitted. When they planned team building activities, they invariably chose venues or events that felt designed to exclude me shooting weekends, rugby matches, or dinners at gentlemen's clubs where my presence would be tolerated but never welcomed. I compensated by working obsessively. I arrived first and left last, responded to emails within minutes regardless of the hour, and delivered projects ahead of schedule with features nobody had requested. My personal life with Marcus suffered as I tried to prove that my sexuality didn't make me less committed to the company's success. Marcus, a pediatric surgeon at Great Ormond Street Hospital, often found me still working at midnight, debugging code that was already perfect or optimizing systems that were already running flawlessly. He would gently close my laptop and remind me that I was trying to earn something that should have been freely given basic professional respect. But I couldn't stop. Every line of code I wrote felt like an argument for my right to exist in their world. Every successful product launch was proof that gay men could lead technology companies. Every satisfied client was evidence that my sexuality was irrelevant to my professional capabilities. I had built Blackwood's entire technological infrastructure from the ground up. Their trading platform processed billions of pounds in daily transactions using algorithms I had designed personally. Their security protocols had never been breached because I had anticipated every possible vulnerability. Their data analytics provided insights that gave them competitive advantages worth millions. Yet I always felt like I was one mistake away from confirming their prejudices, one awkward moment away from justifying their discomfort, one personal revelation away from being seen as a liability rather than an asset. Everything changed when Blackwood Financial secured the contract to build the London Stock Exchange's next-generation trading infrastructure. The £300 million project was the largest in the company's history, a 5-year commitment that would establish us as the premier fintech development firm in Europe. Richard announced it during our quarterly all-hands meeting, his voice trembling with excitement as he described the transformational impact it would have on our company. I had spent 18 months developing the proposal that won us this contract. My team and I had worked through countless weekends, designing revolutionary algorithms that could process trades in microseconds while maintaining absolute security and regulatory compliance. The technical specifications document was 847 pages of pure innovation, every page representing hours of research, coding, and testing. When Richard called me into his office the day after the announcement, I expected congratulations or perhaps a discussion about my bonus structure for delivering such a massive win. Instead, he offered me a chair with the same expression he might use to fire an underperforming intern. He began with corporate pleasantries about the company's growth and the importance of having the right leadership for such a significant project. He praised my technical contributions while simultaneously questioning whether I had the gravitas necessary to interface with the London Stock Exchange's executive committee. He wondered aloud whether someone with my background could effectively represent Blackwood during high-stakes negotiations with institutional investors. The coded language was infuriating in its transparency. Gravitas meant masculine authority. Background meant gay. Effectively represent meant straight, white, and conventionally masculine. He was telling me that my sexuality made me unsuitable to lead the project I had conceived and designed. Instead, he was promoting James Blackwood, His 28-year-old nephew, who had joined the company 6 months earlier as a marketing coordinator. James had an MBA from Cambridge, but had never worked in technology, financial services, or project management. His previous experience consisted of 2 years at a boutique advertising agency where his uncle's connections had secured him a junior account management position. Richard explained that James would be transitioning into the chief technology officer role while I would become senior technical advisor, a newly created position that sounded important but carried no actual authority. James would interface with clients and investors while I would focus on the technical implementation, essentially doing all the work while he received all the credit. The humiliation was methodical and comprehensive. Richard had clearly planned this conversation carefully, anticipating my objections and preparing responses that would make resistance seem unprofessional or emotional. When I mentioned my track record, he acknowledged my valuable contributions while emphasizing the need for fresh perspectives when I pointed out James's lack of experience. He spoke about leadership potential and growth opportunities. The most crushing moment came when he suggested that this transition would actually benefit me by reducing my stress levels and allowing me to focus on what I did best, writing code. He painted my demotion as a favor, as if saving me from the burden of leadership responsibilities I had successfully handled for years. That afternoon, James visited my office to discuss the transition timeline. He was charming in the way that privileged straight men often are: confident without basis, articulate without substance, ambitious without effort. He spoke about his vision for the project using buzzwords he had clearly memorized from business school case studies. When I tried to explain the technical complexities of the trading platform we were building, his eyes glazed over with polite incomprehension. He nodded enthusiastically while completely missing the significance of latency optimization, security protocols, and regulatory compliance requirements. His questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what we were actually building and why it mattered. But James possessed something I would never have: the absolute confidence that comes from never having to prove your right to exist in a space. He assumed he belonged in that role because he had never been told otherwise. His sexuality had never been questioned, his competence had never been doubted, and his authority had never been challenged. He was inheriting a position that I had earned through years of exceptional performance, and he saw it as natural progression rather than undeserved privilege. The next few weeks were a masterclass in corporate gaslighting. My access to client communications was gradually restricted. Strategic meetings were scheduled without my input. James began making decisions about my own technical specifications without consulting me, often choosing approaches that would compromise system performance or security. When I tried to address these concerns with Richard, he accused me of being territorial and resistant to change. He suggested that my attachment to the project was preventing me from supporting the company's best interests. He implied that my emotional investment was clouding my professional judgment, using my passion for the work I had created as evidence of my unsuitability to continue leading it. The hostile takeover of my own project was so gradual and systematic that opposing it made me look paranoid or unstable. Every technical correction I offered was reframed as undermining James's authority. Every concern I raised about implementation challenges was dismissed as negativity or resistance to innovation. My team watched this transition with barely concealed horror. Sarah, David, and Emma had worked with me for years and understood exactly what was happening. But they also understood that speaking up would jeopardize their own careers in an industry where challenging leadership decisions could result in blacklisting across multiple companies. The final insult came when James scheduled a knowledge transfer session where I would teach him everything about the systems I had built. He wanted me to document every algorithm, explain every security protocol, and train him to manage the infrastructure that represented nearly a decade of my life's work. I realized then that they intended to extract every piece of valuable information from my mind before discarding me entirely. The senior technical advisor role was temporary once James felt confident enough to proceed without me, I would be made redundant with a generous severance package and carefully worded references that would prevent me from discussing what had really happened. The knowledge transfer sessions began immediately, each one more humiliating than the last. I sat in conference rooms watching James furiously scribble notes as I explained complex algorithms that had taken me years to develop and perfect. He asked elementary questions that revealed his complete lack of understanding while nodding as if he comprehended every nuance. During one particularly painful session, I was explaining the real time risk assessment protocols when James interrupted to ask whether we could simplify the math to make it more user friendly. I spent 20 minutes explaining why mathematical complexity was essential for accurate risk calculation. Watching his expression shift from confusion to frustration to barely concealed annoyance that I wasn't making this easier for him. The irony was devastating. I was being forced to train my replacement, knowing that his inevitable failures would be attributed to my inadequate preparation rather than his fundamental incompetence. When the system eventually crashed under his management, Richard would blame me for not providing sufficient documentation or training. Meanwhile, my access to critical systems was being systematically revoked. My administrative privileges were downgraded to read-only access. My security clearances were transferred to James. My email was moved to a general circulation list rather than receiving direct client communications. I was becoming a ghost in my own company, watching my life's work being handed over to someone who couldn't distinguish between cloud computing and weather forecasting. The emotional toll was crushing. I had spent 9 years building something extraordinary, and it was being destroyed by prejudice disguised as business strategy. Marcus found me crying in our kitchen one evening, overwhelmed by the realization that excellence meant nothing when corporate leadership decided your identity was incompatible with their vision of success. But the worst was yet to come. 3 weeks before the official transition, Richard called an emergency board meeting to discuss concerns about my recent performance. He had compiled a dossier of manufactured complaints, missed deadlines that had never existed, client dissatisfaction that had never been reported, team conflicts that had never occurred. The meeting was a carefully orchestrated assassination. Richard presented me as an increasingly unstable employee whose emotional attachment to the project was compromising his judgment. He suggested that my resistance to James's leadership indicated professional jealousy and an inability to work collaboratively. He painted my technical expertise as obsessive perfectionism that was slowing down project timelines. 2 board members, both longtime friends of Richard's family, nodded gravely as he described my concerning behavior patterns. They asked leading questions designed to elicit responses that would support his narrative. When I tried to defend myself with facts and documentation, they interpreted my passion as evidence of the emotional instability Richard had described. The coup de grace came when Richard revealed that he had been monitoring my interactions with team members and had documented several instances of inappropriate behavior. These turned out to be private conversations where I had expressed frustration about the transition process conversations that had been reported back to him by colleagues who had been pressured to spy on me. By the end of that meeting, I had been officially removed from the London Stock Exchange project and placed on administrative leave pending a comprehensive performance review. The company's HR department would conduct an investigation into my fitness for continued employment, during which I was forbidden from contacting clients, accessing company systems, or communicating with team members. I cleaned out my office that same afternoon, packing 9 years of work into cardboard boxes while James sat at my desk, learning to use systems he would never truly understand. Sarah, David, and Emma watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and terror. They understood that supporting me would mark them for similar treatment. The security escort was the final humiliation. Richard had arranged for a uniformed guard to accompany me as I removed my personal belongings, as if I posed some kind of threat to company property or personnel. The guard was polite but firm, ensuring that I took only items that were clearly personal and leaving behind anything that could be considered company property. As I walked through the office for the last time, carrying boxes filled with personal photographs and coffee mugs, I could feel the eyes of every employee following me. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed relieved that they weren't in my position, and a few appeared to be calculating how my departure might benefit their own careers. The drive home through London traffic gave me time to process what had just happened. I had been professionally executed for the crime of being gay while exceptional. My sexuality hadn't prevented me from succeeding, it had made my success threatening to people who believed that leadership positions should be reserved for straight white men. Marcus was waiting when I arrived home, having taken the afternoon off from the hospital after receiving my text about what had happened. He helped me carry the boxes inside, then held me while I finally allowed myself to grieve for the career I had lost and the work I would never see completed. But even in my devastation, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't moderating my voice, hiding my identity, or apologizing for existing. The worst thing they could do to me had already happened, and I had survived it. That evening, as I sat surrounded by boxes filled with the debris of my former life, I began to understand something that would change everything. Richard and James had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed that removing me from the project would have no consequences beyond eliminating an inconvenient reminder of diversity. They had no idea what they had actually done. What Richard Blackwood never understood was that I hadn't just built Blackwood Financial's technology infrastructure, I had become it. Every system, every protocol, every algorithm contained not just my code, but my understanding of how those systems needed to interact with each other. The trading platform wasn't just software. It was a complex ecosystem that required constant monitoring, adjustment, and intuitive understanding that came from years of intimate familiarity. James spent his first week as CTO scheduling meetings with clients he had never spoken to, discussing systems he had never operated, and making promises about capabilities he didn't understand. He approached technology leadership like a marketing campaign, focusing on presentation rather than substance, convinced that confidence could substitute for competence. The first signs of trouble appeared exactly 9 days after my departure. The real-time trading algorithms began exhibiting minor latency issues during peak trading hours. Nothing catastrophic, just microsecond delays that most people wouldn't notice, but that could cost millions in high-frequency trading environments. James dismissed these concerns when the development team brought them to his attention, suggesting they were overthinking minor performance variations. Sarah, David, and Emma tried to explain that these weren't random variations but symptoms of deeper systemic issues. The algorithms I had designed required constant calibration based on market conditions, trading volumes, and network performance. They were self-optimizing systems that needed human oversight from someone who understood their underlying logic. But James had been told he was in charge of technology, and he interpreted that as meaning he could override the technical team's concerns with executive authority. He insisted that the minor delays were acceptable and that the team should focus on more important priorities, like preparing for the upcoming client demonstration. The demonstration was scheduled for exactly 3 weeks after my departure, a high-stakes presentation to the London Stock Exchange's Executive Committee, several major institutional investors, and representatives from the Bank of England. Richard had planned this as James's debut performance, his opportunity to prove that the leadership transition had been successful. I watched the preparation for this demonstration from a distance, receiving updates from former colleagues who were genuinely concerned about what they were witnessing. James had insisted on modifying several core algorithms to make them more impressive for the demonstration, despite warnings that these changes could destabilize the entire system. Meanwhile, the performance review that was supposed to determine my employment status had been quietly abandoned. HR had found no evidence of the misconduct Richard had alleged, but admitting that would have required acknowledging that my removal had been unjustified. Instead, they offered me a generous severance package with a non disclosure agreement that would prevent me from discussing the circumstances of my departure. I declined their offer. The morning of the demonstration, I received a call from Sarah. She was calling from her personal phone, speaking quietly from the bathroom of a coffee shop near the office. The system was exhibiting serious instabilities that James was refusing to acknowledge. The modified algorithms were creating cascading failures that threatened to crash the entire platform. She begged me to help, not for the company, but for the team members whose careers would be destroyed if the demonstration failed catastrophically. I told her there was nothing I could do. My access had been revoked, my authority had been transferred, and any attempt to intervene would be seen as sabotage. But Sarah's call confirmed something I had suspected for weeks. The system they were about to demonstrate wasn't just flawed, it was fundamentally compromised. James's modifications had introduced vulnerabilities that would become apparent under stress testing. The latency issues were symptoms of memory leaks that would eventually cause complete system failure. The demonstration began at 2:00 p.m. in Blackwood's largest conference room with live video feeds to investors across Europe and North America. Richard introduced James as the visionary leader who had designed the revolutionary trading platform they were about to witness. James stood confidently at the head of the table, his presentation slides filled with technical terminology he had memorized but didn't understand. For the first few minutes, everything appeared normal. The trading algorithms processed sample transactions smoothly, the user interface responded quickly, and the real-time analytics displayed the kind of performance metrics that impressed non-technical audiences. James spoke enthusiastically about disruptive innovation and paradigm shifts, using buzzwords that sounded authoritative to people who didn't understand the underlying technology. But I knew exactly what would happen next. The demonstration was using synthetic data designed to stress test the system under extreme conditions. When they reached the point where the algorithms needed to process multiple simultaneous high-volume transactions, the memory leaks that James had dismissed would cascade into complete system failure. It happened exactly 9 seconds into the stress test, just as I had calculated it would. The trading platform didn't crash gradually, it simply stopped functioning. The screens went black, the algorithms stopped processing, and the entire system became completely unresponsive. 9 years of development work, £300 million in client investment, and Blackwood Financial's reputation died in the space of a heartbeat. The silence in that conference room was absolute. Richard stared at the blank screens with the expression of someone watching their career disintegrate in real time. James frantically clicked his mouse, desperately trying to resurrect a system he had never understood and had accidentally murdered. The London Stock Exchange's executive committee asked pointed questions about system reliability, data security, and backup protocols. The institutional investors inquired about the company's technical leadership and quality assurance processes. The Bank of England representatives requested detailed documentation about the platform's regulatory compliance. James couldn't answer any of these questions because he didn't understand the systems he was supposed to be leading. Richard couldn't answer them because he had fired the only person who could. The demonstration that was supposed to establish Blackwood as Europe's premier fintech company instead revealed them as a firm that had prioritized nepotism over competence. The contract cancellation came within hours. The London Stock Exchange released a diplomatic statement about reconsidering their technology partnership requirements, but the financial press understood exactly what had happened. Blackwood Financial had promised revolutionary technology and delivered amateur hour. That evening, Richard called my personal phone for the first time since my departure. His voice was barely controlled panic as he asked if I could consult on the technical issues they were experiencing. He offered me a substantial fee to help repair the damage, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of why these problems had occurred. I listened to his desperate plea in complete silence, then delivered the response I had been rehearsing for weeks. I told him that I was no longer available to solve problems created by his decision to prioritize prejudice over competence. I suggested he consult with his nephew, who was, after all, the visionary leader he had chosen to replace me. The line went quiet for several seconds before Richard hung up without another word. 6 months later, Blackwood Financial Technologies ceased operations. The failed demonstration had destroyed their reputation, triggered client lawsuits, and revealed the fundamental weakness of a company built on connections rather than competence. Richard declared bankruptcy and retired to his country estate, while James returned to his advertising career with a much clearer understanding of his own limitations. The aftermath taught me something profound about the nature of prejudice in corporate environments. Homophobia hadn't just cost me a job, it had destroyed an entire company. Richard's discomfort with my sexuality had led him to make a series of decisions that were not just morally wrong, but strategically catastrophic. I spent those 6 months working as an independent consultant, helping other fintech companies build the kind of secure, innovative trading platforms that Blackwood had failed to deliver. My reputation in the industry, far from being damaged by my departure, was enhanced by the spectacular failure of my replacement. Marcus and I used that time to reassess what we wanted from our careers and our lives. He had watched me sacrifice my mental health and personal happiness trying to earn acceptance from people who would never see me as anything more than a tolerated inconvenience. The destruction of Blackwood Financial, while professionally satisfying, had also freed me from the exhausting burden of proving my worth to people who had already decided I was worthless. The most powerful realization was that my sexuality hadn't been a liability to overcome, it had been a source of strength that I had been trained to suppress. The analytical thinking, creative problem solving, and resilience that had made me an exceptional CTO were all qualities that had been sharpened by my experience as a gay man navigating hostile environments. When I finally launched my own technology consultancy, I made a conscious decision to be completely authentic from the beginning. I refused clients who made homophobic comments. I hired diverse teams that included people who had been overlooked by traditional companies. I built a business culture where excellence was valued over conformity. Today, my company employs over 40 people and has contracts with some of Europe's largest financial institutions. We've never had a system failure, never missed a deadline, and never compromised our values for the sake of profit. The same principles that guided my work at Blackwood Precision, innovation, and reliability now guide a company where everyone can be completely authentic while doing the best work of their careers. Richard Blackwood learned that prejudice is expensive, but I learned something more valuable. Authenticity is profitable. When you stop trying to be acceptable to people who will never accept you, you can finally become extraordinary for people who value what you actually bring to the world. If this story resonated with you, whether you're LGBTQ+, or simply someone who believes that talent matters more than prejudice, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel and share your own experiences in the comments. Together, we can build workplaces where everyone can succeed without having to hide who they are. And remember, when they try to replace you with their nephew, make sure your code is irreplaceable. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being excellent while they discover what incompetence actually costs.